Okay, Beat, we are going to continue with the second part of our discussion on Chinese archery. And today I'm going to start or continue with a set of questions. First of all, welcome back to Razmavstar TV, Beat.
Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much. So the first question which I have, and we talked about it um, briefly last time, but didn't elaborate. But a question which I have from one of the viewers is, how many stripes or parts of horn in general do Chinese use for the bows? We know that China is a huge country. Possibly they have different types of bows, but could you just elaborate on it a bit?
Okay, that's actually really interesting because I was speaking about somebody today about this very thing. Normally, Chinese bows have two pieces of horn, one for the upper limb, one for the lower limb, that meet in the middle of the handle, exactly as you would expect. There are some Qing bows where, in an Ottoman bow, you have a chelik, a tiny little
Yes.
piece of bone or ivory between the ends of the horn where they meet on the handle. Um, in some of the older Persian manuscripts and some of the Mamluk manuscripts, they call this Ibranchik. Um, in China, certainly from the Qing dynasty, there are X-rays of bows showing it's this long. So that the hand grip is that long. The separation between the two pieces of horn are that long. Having said that, in a catalogue of weapons from the Imperial Collection, there is a bow belonging to, I think it's the Qianlong Emperor, which has this is a Manchu bow, right? So it's a really big bow, single strip of buffalo horn from one end to the other. There's no joint in the middle. The Emperor asks, get me a big buffalo horn. The Emperor gets it. This would not make, actually, it may not be as good as a bow made from two pieces of horn because the horn may vary in strength from the tip to the base. I don't know, but when you're the Emperor, you've got the best bow makers available, so therefore you get the best horn. As far as I know, the Chinese never used more than two horn strips, but that is a generalization. It's quite possible that under restricted circumstances, if they couldn't get the horn they wanted, they would do what the Persians did and use long strips of horn.
How many did you use, just for our viewers to remind them of?
Okay. Well, from the manuscripts you've translated, what it appears to me is bows were allocated a certain number of strips depending on what was the purpose of the bow. So the smallest number, I mean, obviously the smallest number is one strip per limb, and that was definitely done. But two strips per limb weren't considered to be particularly good. Three strips was better. Four strips was what they generally thought was pretty, the best compromise. Six strips is known. There are surviving bows with six strips of horn. If you're an English reader, you can go and look up Balfour's article on composite bows, and there is a dissection of a Persian bow in that with multiple strips of horn. So he had a bow. It was in the Pitt Rivers Museum, and he had it cut into sections, and in certain sections peeled back all the different layers, and it's a complete dissection of a Persian bow. This would have been probably a Qajar bow. It's not as sophisticated as you see in Safavid bows. Remember, in your book, the Safavid bows are really sophisticated looking. They've got variations in the bending section of the limb, the ridge section of the limb, they're quite complex.
Yes.
Some Safavid bows, their descendants in the Qajar era were equally sophisticated, but there are other bows that weren't. And it's important to remember that in the translations that you did, they mention commonly at least 4 types of bow in use at the same time.
Yes. That's right.
So, the same thing happened in China. There were different types of bows used for different things. I mean, the Chinese had a long tradition, which is current today in Afghanistan, of making bows to shoot pellets.
Yes. Yes.
And there's a painting from the Song Dynasty from like the 1100s or so, of a man out on horseback with a little bag on his side and what looks like a black longbow with a round bit in the middle, which is to hold the pellets. And almost certainly, judging by the fact that it's got ribs on the back and the front, it's a laminated bamboo bow that's been black lacquered for protection. And I mean, these were used by hunters for hunting birds because you don't care if you lose a pellet. We discussed about off air last week about crescent shaped heads.
Yes.
Or whatever they call.
Okay, and then the second question, horn. What type of horn did they use? Was it buffalo?
It was almost always buffalo.
Yes.
And in that encyclopedia I showed you, which I still have here, this one.
Yes.
They make fun of the northern barbarians, by which they meant the Mongols, for using sheep horn, by which they probably meant agali.
Yes.
And because they can't get the good water buffalo horn.
Okay. Pete, another question which I have: why did they use buffalo horn? Because of quality.
I think it was mainly quality. To some extent, water buffalo were extensively used in China from the early times for plowing fields and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a whole group of classical paintings of Lao Tzu, the famous philosopher, riding on the back of a water buffalo. I mean, and all the paintings I've seen, the water buffaloes have very nice horns if you were going to make a bow.
Yes.
The use of water buffalo horn was a side effect of the fact that when a water buffalo got really old and couldn't work in the fields, it was slaughtered for meat. And the things that were taken out of the water buffalo, aside from the meat, were its hide, which is very good for leather shields or any kind of thick leather that you needed that was really strong. Sorry, I've got all these things laying around. So, its sinews, which are exceptionally good quality. Its bone, which is very dense, and it's excellent for making archer's rings, the tips of bone-tipped bows, all kinds of things. It's very dense and very strong, and its horns.
Yeah. And another question: the wooden core. Chinese. What type of wooden core did they use?
This is very interesting. The study that was done in Chengdu on the bow shop there during it was basically during the late Second World War years, said that they examined a number of bows because when the Kuomintang, the nationalist government, was in retreat, after the Japanese were defeated, then a civil war broke out between the communists under Mao and the Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek. And the Kuomintang eventually retreated to Taiwan. Now, they had with them a large part of the collection of bows from the Forbidden City in Beijing. And this book had a look at them. And what it said was, northern Chinese bows had wooden cores, and southern Chinese bows had bamboo cores. So that, I mean, from a functional point of view, the only thing I can say is after 200 years, the bamboo cores start to deteriorate.
Yes.
They start to break down, whereas the wooden cores don't necessarily do that. But from a practical point of view, this is the core from the handle to the ears. So it's not in ears. The ears were usually made of different types of wood, sometimes quite heavy woods like sandalwood.
Oh, so
So I mean, I've made things out of sandalwood, and it's a beautiful carving wood. You can get such a high quality polish on it. It's quite dense. It's enormously strong. I've got half a log of sandalwood in my wood storage area, which one day I'm going to split up and make into bow tips. It smells beautifully. Sandalwood, the smell is just, if you cut a piece of this wood, it's just like perfume.
yes.
And in China, it was used a lot for tool handles because it was so strong. It just didn't wear out. In bow tips, it's a bit heavy. I think, particularly considering how long Qing Dynasty bows tips were, something like birch or something might be better. Birch is not a light wood, but it's strong, and the ratio of strength to weight is very practical.
Very interesting question. I was asked, did they use maple wood? Maple?
I believe there are some references to maple-like wood being used for the section where what the Turks call the kasan, and the Persians call the gosha, that ridge section where it bends up and the tip of the bow is joined. In Manchu times, that could be made of several different woods, and they see any fine-grained wood that was strong and accepted glue well was applicable. Now, in the northern style bows in the Manchu period, whether maple was used or not, I couldn't say with any precision about numbers of bows that were made one way or the other. I've got the Chengdu bow shop book, so I'll have a look through it and find out if I can find anything more definitive. But the Chinese were, in the Qing dynasty, for instance, when they're ruled by Manchus using Manchu style archery, but most of the bow makers were Chinese.
Yeah.
So they learned how to make Manchu bows. They made beautiful Manchu bows. There are different styles, some with long, slender, curved ears, some with very straight, very blocky ears, some with horn inserts that the nock of the bow is carved into, others without that. Oh, incidentally, just as a matter of construction, in case anyone's interested, on a Manchu bow, the section from the handle to where the ears come out is one piece of bamboo. The handle on the back is glued on as a separate piece, as are Korean bows. Then the kind of ridge section is another piece of wood, and the tips, the straight sections at the end, that's another piece of wood. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and counting the handle, 6 pieces of wood in a Manchu style Qing dynasty bow.
Okay.
So it's not just big bits stuck together. It's they thought out the direction of the grain and everything to make the strongest bow possible, and they were very confident that their glues would work.
So the core was, like many composite bows, was wooden, or in this case bamboo, and then we had horn, and on the other side we had tendons, correct?
Yeah.
In Chinese bows. Okay, what kind of tendons did they use?
Well, the description in the Chengdu book is ox tendons, by which they meant castrated water buffalo and castrated cattle in general. I think from what modern bow makers have discovered, the harder the animal works, the better the tendons are. So if it's a wild animal, they're very good. If it's a hard-working animal, they're under pressure for its whole life, and they become very strong and very tough. The book on bow making in Chengdu says that they bought the tendons, they ground them up to break them into fibers, and then they sorted the fibers by length, as did the Turks, and then they laid them down. So we're looking at cattle tendons. They liked back tendons a lot. Like the Turks and the Persians used a lot of Achilles tendons, but the Chinese particularly like back tendons. Now, whether this is because the back tendons in water buffalo are particularly suitable, I don't know. But we've got to remember the Manchus came from the northeast up in the forest zone, and they would have had access to elk tendons, moose tendons, because, I mean, in Eurasia, what the Americans call an elk was just called a red deer.
Yes.
What the Americans call a moose was called an elk. This causes lots of confusion when you discuss these animals.
It's true. It's true. Yeah, it's right. You know, it was like I was talking to a Japanese scholar yesterday, and he said he was so angry. And he said, "Can you tell English speakers not to call hamon temper line? It's not tempered, it's hardened." Just said, I will, but
well, that's actually perfectly true, isn't it?
Yeah, but I said, okay, I will, but what can I do? I cannot change the English language. Yeah, but we really dislike this. I said, yeah, okay, you know.
I'll give you an example that irritates me. You can see anybody from England or America, and when they talk about the bow of a crossbow, they call it the prod.
Yeah.
That is entirely incorrect. Prod is a misreading of a 14th century manuscript. And the word they misread, I think the guy's name was Mercer, he misread rod, and it actually referred to the stock of the crossbow, not the bow. So it's entirely wrong. First of all, it's the wrong pronunciation of the word. The P is an error. And secondly, it's not the bow, it's the stock. And this was, I think, a study on this was published in the 70s, 1970s, when I was but a boy. And I came across it, and it was so clear because it was quoted from the Pipe Rolls or some other such ancient document in England. So this kind of thing is quite normal.
Another question. So we have three materials, right? And now we are going to stick them to each other. What kind of natural glue did the Chinese use? Bow makers.
Liked fish mouth glue. Okay. Now, almost certainly the Manchus had access to sturgeon glue, because the Amur River has I don't know what it's like now, had a lot of sturgeon. In fact, see, we think of sturgeon and caviar of being rare and everything, but sturgeon lived from Scotland to north of Korea. They live all across North America as well, I might add. I mean, I've been in North America and seen sturgeon.
Do they have caviar which is usable?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
They just don't have an industry for it. The biggest sturgeon I saw was about 7 or 8 feet long. So 2 to 2.5 meters long. Not like but that may have been age related. The sturgeon that they get in the Volga and that are sometimes 33 feet long. Well, they used to be. I mean, overfishing has made them smaller.
Okay.
But
yes.
But sturgeon mouth. But in general China, they use a thing called I think yellow croaker.
Oh.
It's a sea fish. If you go to a Chinese market or a Chinese grocery store, you can see dried pieces of this that are totally suitable for glue.
Okay.
Sold in packets for $4 or $5, and you'd have 5 or 6 pieces of this, and you just boil it up and then skim off the collect the glue, dehydrate it. When it's dried out, it'll store forever. It's really quite good.
And one question: do Chinese bows look? I mean, I know you cannot generalize, but when you compare Persian bows to Ottoman bows in general, I know you can. Persian bows tend to be heavier with, like wider bow arms, and in general, Ottomans not that much. What about Chinese bows? If I can generalize, I know you can. There are different varieties.
I think the problem is there was a big change from the Ming Dynasty to the Qing Dynasty. So if you went late Southern Sung, Yuan, Ming, you'd be looking at bows that were very closely related to Persian and Turkish bows. If you saw one, you would have to think to make sure you knew which one it was. In the Qing dynasty, things exploded and we had these giant composite bows. But they were a reaction, as we discussed last time, to a different style of warfare. And the fact that the Manchus were living in dense forests when they were hunting with bows and arrows, and you couldn't say, I'll shoot that person or animal 200 meters over there, because you couldn't see 200 meters. So that's the big difference. If you look at a Chinese bow of the Qing dynasty, section by section, cross section by cross section, and then miniaturize it, you get something very similar to a Turkish or Persian bow. The exception being these giant bows did not have long ridge sections. They had very short ridge sections.
Did Chinese use almost always composite bows, or did they also use self bows or bows which were made of one piece?
Okay, militarily, with several exceptions, they've used composite bows for the last 3,000 years. However, there are tribal peoples in China who are not Chinese, who belong to the Mon Khmer groups, and there was a state in southern China called Tai, where the inhabitants migrated south, and we call them Thais now. They were ethnically similar to Thais. They moved south into Southeast Asia, and they took their traditions with them. So China was not a monolingual, monocultural place. It still isn't. I mean, one of the things that was interesting, even during the period of Mao, the Chinese recognized all these different nationalities as part of China, and they had different languages and different cultures. So in the Northwest, there was at least one group. I think they're called the Toba, or Toba in some English transliterations, who founded a series of dynasties in North China. They were tribal people from the north. They were possibly more forest people than steppe people, and they had longbows. Now, whether they were laminated longbows or single piece longbows, I haven't seen anything yet to say. My guess is laminated, because there were laminated bows further up into the north. See, we think now of like Korea in its two parts, but Korea under the Goguryeo was a huge place. Yes. A lot of northeastern area was under the control of these dynasties.
Yes.
And so there were lots of complicated things going on. If you walked into a town, you would probably see composite bows. But there's a very famous scroll called the Qingming Festival that was painted in the 1100s, early 1100s, late 1000-somethings. I've got actually a full-length copy of it. And it was basically just a panoramic view of this river scene in the old northern Sun capital of Kaifeng. And as you go along, there are restaurants, and they have little signs on them, Mr. Wang's House of Good Smells and all this kind of stuff. And way along, there is a man in a bow shop testing a bow. And it's a bamboo longbow. It's not a composite bow at all.
Another question.
Yeah.
What kind of string did they use? What kind of material did they use to make a string?
This is really interesting. Premier strings were made out of unwound silk. Unwound silk means you get a silkworm cocoon, you find the end of the fiber, you put it on a little thing, and you wind the whole length in one piece, a kilometer or two long. I don't know how long. And then you get a whole group of these, and you put them on a machine that twists them together, and you end up with this super strong material. This is not the same as silk thread. If you buy some silk thread to sew something up, that's usually made, they tear up the cocoons into little pieces and they spin them together like cotton is spun together. This is very nice, very smooth, but it's nowhere near as strong as unspun silk. In America, they sometimes call it filament silk. It was very popular among fly fishers in the old days for tying those intricate little flies for catching fish. You can still buy it. I bought mine from Aurora Silk in Oregon. And they had silk that came from China and they had silk that came from Uzbekistan. And the thickness that is corresponding to that used in bowstrings is described now as buttonhole silk because it was used for sewing up buttonholes in silk clothes. It's really strong. It's very resistant to moisture changes and temperature changes. It is susceptible to ultraviolet. Apparently, if you dye it with indigo, that protects it from ultraviolet. And you can actually buy indigo silk that's dyed from natural indigo still to this day. I made quite a large number of silk bowstrings for flight shooting and things like that. And my experience is it's incredibly slippery. It is. We shot, like, one year I stayed with Yarpin K Copper Dryer in Georgia, which was like 35, 40 degrees and 90% humidity. And then we went up to Utah for the flight shooting, and that was about the same temperature, but the humidity was only 10%. And all of the linen strings broke because they don't like the humidity. And all of the silk strings survived without any problem.
Okay. And Pete, just for our viewers.
Oh, I should have mentioned there's one other major material they use for strings, and it's a grass fiber called ramie, R-A-M-I-E, which is very strong and quite light as well. Less stretched than silk.
Okay. Pete, just one more question, just for our viewers. Tell us, when we have a wooden core, I know at least everyone who watches that knows that, but just to remind them, which part is horn and which part are the tendons of a bow? Is it on the belly, or just to explain?
Okay, so the belly of the bow is covered by horn.
Yes.
And the back of the bow is covered by the sinew tendons in parallel to, well, on the same axis as the length of the bow.
Yes.
So there are occasions where you sometimes wrap sinew spirally around bows. This wasn't done in later Chinese bows. It may have been done in earlier Chinese bows. We just depend on archaeological discovery to answer those questions.
Just for our viewers, the belly is the side which faces you as an archer.
Yeah, when you're holding a strung bow,
yes,
the belly faces you, the back faces away. The reason those names are used, and they're used in many cultures, it's not just English terminology, is because when you bend towards your belly.
Yes.
If you go the other way, it hurts and things can go horribly wrong. But yeah, that's basically it. When you think about it, and weirdly enough, in modern American archery terminology, by which I mean the 1960s, they called the back and the face of the bow because it was facing you.
Oh yes, face as well. That's true.
Yeah. So it's really quite interesting.
Okay, just one more, yes, before we go to this, but let me just stick on the bow because, did Chinese, that's a very good question, inscribe their bows as Persians did sometimes? Did they write the name?
Yeah. Sometimes there are inscriptions on bows. I don't have one with an inscription on it. I've seen reference to it. Oh, I've actually seen one. I saw one of the Chendong Emperor's bows which had a long inscription on it. Plus, when these bows were stored, they would be stored with a label saying who made the bow and who it was for and what year and everything like that. So that is a thing. It wasn't done exactly the same way as Persian, Turkish, and Arab bows, but it was definitely done. See, the thing that's possibly not well known is that from before the Han Dynasty, so before 200 BCE, weapons in China were often inscribed with the name of the maker, the inspector, and the head of the factory where they were made, as a quality control measure. So swords, if you looked on the tang of a sword, unlike a Japanese sword, which might say made by, Matsuhiro, whatever, in China, they would say made in such and such a factory of such and such a steel, workman such and such, inspector such and such, because they had a long tradition of notation. And bows were pretty much the same. I haven't seen, like in Turkish arrows, you often have the name of the archer on flight arrows and that. So in a competition, they can be sorted out.
Yeah.
I've never seen that. I have seen words written on arrows, though. There's one in the Grayson collection, but it had been refletched in its lifetime, and they put the feather straight down the middle of the characters, and it had wiped out one half of the characters. And we don't know what it means.
And did they decorate their bows like Persians did sometimes with floral designs and miniatures? I mean, okay, or picturesque or pictures and things like that.
Definitely. There's a whole group of Qing Dynasty bows where they used translucent buffalo horn, so you can see through it. They painted pictures on the core and then glued the horn on so you could see the pictures through the horn.
Magnificent.
They also did mosaics and strips of different colored material to make patterns on the bow surface. I think Peter Decker has pointed this out on one of his. Actually, I might have some pictures of him here. I've got a book with that kind of stuff in it. It's without doubt quite common for me to have a book handy. This is the Grayson collection.
That's right.
Yeah. Now this does have the odd Persian bow in it, but it has a lot of beautiful Qing Dynasty bows. I'm just seeing if I can find one of the painted bows. It really has a lot of beautiful Qing Dynasty stuff. Okay. First, I'll show you that one.
Magnificent.
And then on the other side of the page, this is more typical for war bows and things like that, where they've chosen the birch bark or dyed it to make patterns. Peter says that some of these patterns are almost like camouflage, that they are designed to make the bow difficult to see in a forest. Oh, and speaking about bows that have inscriptions on them, the ear of that bow has a whole inscription on it.
I mean,
so yeah.
Did I see it correctly, Bede? That can you collapse that bow, or what was that? Did you you can bend it? The picture.
No. There are bows you can take apart at the handle.
Yeah.
Or they have a hinge at the handle so that the backs fold together.
Yes.
Like
yes.
There might be one in here. I'm not sure. I know definitely there was one in the. Just as a matter of interest, I should show you this picture.
Interesting. Yes.
If you get a chance to look at this picture, this is one of the most perfect pictures of the Manchu style of shooting. A few years ago, I noticed that the arrowhead wasn't sitting on his thumb. And I thought, they've done this. He's had to stand there for 2 minutes while I took the picture. Because remember, no flash photography or anything like that. And he's kind of like this. But then I found that video I told you about showing that is just before he shoots. he's lifted the arrow off the bow so the feathers don't get ruffled. And if you, I don't know whether you can see this or not, but if you look very closely, the feathers are perfect.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is actually a real archer who was very good at what he does. There's several things. I think it was originally I read this in a book by a famous Chinese author, famous in the West, called Lin Yu Tang, who wrote a lot of very interesting things that worked rather well when you. I'm just looking really closely. I think the bow at the top, they call it a monkey bow because it doesn't have ears.
Yeah.
It has a string for shooting pellets. If you look really carefully at the handle, you can see a hinge.
I can, yes.
Yeah. So definitely all this kind of stuff was going on.
Okay. And Pete, let us move on to another topic because I have this question.
Yeah, sure.
Arrow shafts, what kind of materials did they? Did they use reed as Persians did?
No. In the in the Ming Dynasty and before, it was quite common in the south of China to use bamboo because they had very strong bamboo, like the bamboo used in Korea and Japan. I mean, these are varieties of the same type of bamboo. In the north, they always used wood. Birch was very common. I've got a pair of birch arrows with bamboo inserts to support the nock. Maybe our next video, I'll get them out and we'll have a look at them.
So,
yes.
do you remember in Persian manuscripts, they also talk about different materials for shafts? It's very interesting to see that.
Yeah, well, in Persian manuscripts, you hear about reed, kelp,
Yes.
poplar,
Yes.
willow.
Yes, willow as well.
There's quite a few. Well, khadang is
yes.
Yeah. So the I think reed, the quality of reed that was used in Persian arrows and used in Iraq and in northern India, Gujarat was famous for it, is much stronger than everyday reed.
Oh yeah, of course. Of course.
If we're using reed as a botanical term, it refers to Phragmites australis, used to be called Cumitatus, I think. The type of reed used for arrows in Iran and northern India and Iraq and some parts of Egypt was incredibly hard. I've got a 6.5 millimeter arrow shaft with an armor-piercing head on it from India, and it's only 6.5 millimeters in diameter. But when I put it on a spine tester, when I first got it, it's spine tested for a 90-pound bow. So this reed is very hard. If I go out and go down the street to the river at the bottom of my street and pick some reeds out, you can crush them in your fingers. And I actually went and discussed this with a botanist whose speciality was grasses. So reeds are grasses, wheat is a grass, bamboo is a grass. And I took in some bamboo arrows from Korea and some reed arrows from northern India. And he said, look, without cross-sectioning, you can't be 100% sure, but the reed arrows are Phragmites, the bamboo arrows are one of the bamboo families. So that type of reed, its strength depends on its environment. So certain places that reed's really good for making arrows. Other places, certain parts of North America, the Apaches and people like that occasionally used it. It's okay, but it's nowhere near as strong as, say, Gujarati reed or something like that. These materials were so well thought of that there was an export trade from Gujarat to Iran and other places of reeds for making arrows because there was so much they were so superior. See, a reed arrow of the same diameter and the same stiffness is actually lighter than a bamboo arrow, which means you can put a heavier head in it.
Yes. Another question which I have is, what kind of, did they insert another or additional material in arrow nock?
Oh, yeah, it's really quite interesting because obviously when they were making bamboo arrows, you can carve a nock in a bamboo arrow and just wrap it with thread and it'll work perfectly. And in Japanese shrines and temples, often the arrows given as dedications are made that way. And it almost certainly war arrows were made that way in Japan. And in China, that was definitely done as well because they're Han Dynasty arrows where the nock is in fact carved out of the, because bamboo is really hard. I mean, when it's properly cured and everything, it's a very hard material. I've got some, I'm going to make some darts for a Navak. And I've got offcuts of some bamboo shafts that a friend gave me. And I'm going to use those. And I'm not going to bother putting separate nocks in those. I will in the full length shafts because they're more beautiful. You know, but the Chinese definitely, even on wooden arrows, there's a whole series of different ways they added nocks. So some wooden arrows just have the nock carved out. They're a self nock.
Okay.
Those are normally wrapped in sinew below the nock just to double strength it. Others are a different type of hardwood that has been tenoned onto the end, somewhat like Turkish arrows, not in pieces like Turkish arrows, but similar. I've got a pair of arrows where they cut a slot in the end of the arrow and glued a wedge of bamboo in and then carved the nock in the bamboo, which is somewhat like old English longbow arrows where they cut a slot and put a piece of horn in there. And I've seen Chinese arrows with applied horn nocks, which were a horn nock with a tube cut out of it that glues on the end of the arrow. And quite often on Chinese arrows in the Qing dynasty, where the sinew is wrapped, they would wrap that with something else like very thin leather or fish skin, particularly. So maybe shark skin, shagreen, something like that, because it gave you a good grip when you're picking up the arrow and protected the sinew from moisture.
Okay, and fletching, what kind of feathers or plume did they use?
Chinese traditionally liked either vulture or eagle. But if you look at the old books, there's a whole slew of different materials. Pheasant. Pheasant are very pretty, and pheasant wing feathers are very strong and straight. The earliest description of arrows, which is I think in the Book of Rights or something like that, they specify the fletching should be 1/6 or 1/5 the length of the arrow. I've actually got it here. I'll see if I can find it. So the fletching is let's go for 1/6 the length of the arrow, and the height of the fletching should be the thickness of the arrow. But when you get to the Qing dynasty, the fletching can be this high, but it's still, I mean, on a 90 centimeter arrow, you might find 25, 30 centimeters of fletching. So that's a bigger proportion. I'll just see if I can find it. The thing about this is Stephen Selby's book. The thing about it is it's got so much material in it. Maybe I can do it by the index.
Bede, another question I have: did they use to glue the feathers to the shaft?
Okay, they generally used hide glue for that.
Yes.
The Chinese had access to lacquer, which is waterproof, so they could use hide glue to glue something on, and then lacquer around it and prevent any moisture getting in. Though, to be honest, I've tried to remove feathers from old Japanese arrows where the feathers had been eaten away, and I wanted to replace them. And I tried to soak the fletching off because hide glue, fish glue are soluble in water. It's quite difficult. I don't think arrows that were prepared like several months ahead and stored, the glue polymerizes. It's not as susceptible to moisture as when you do it. Like when I fletched some arrows up with hide glue for a flight archery match, and I fletched them up a week before we went into the desert, and it was, like 40 degrees, and the glue basically melted because it's so hot. But if I'd done it a year before, I don't think I would have had that problem.
Yes.
So,
and then, okay, and I have another question.
They also just use lacquer to glue them on, and lacquer is totally waterproof. So if you paint, this is what the Japanese call a rushi. If you paint lacquer on the base of the feather and just hold it against the shaft, it will glue itself to the shaft.
Yes.
And it's really strong.
And you do not to make a carving on the shaft, do you?
No, you make sure the shaft is clean. You put the lacquer on the feather, just with a fine brush, just down the base of the feather.
Yes.
And just hold it on. I'm not quite sure of the setting time. See, we have fletching jigs to put feathers on arrows.
Yes.
But in the old days, they never used anything like that. They just did it by hand.
Yes.
And they used glues that set very fast.
Yes.
In one of the Chinese, the Zhengdu bowmaking book explains how to glue feathers on. And they would put the glue on hot, put the feather on the arrow, it would kind of set, and then they would get a hot iron and run it along the base of the feather to make sure it was perfectly straight.
Yes.
So these techniques are not what we do. Tom Duvernay's 3 videos on Korean bow making and fletching show them doing that. They weren't using hide glue because it was, like in the late 20th century, early 2000s, they used white wood glue.
Yes.
And if you let it dry a little bit, it will actually do exactly the same thing.
Okay, another question. Did the Chinese use tanked arrows mostly, or did they use socketed arrows, or both?
Mainly tanged.
Arrowheads, I'm sorry, arrowheads, yes.
Arrowheads. Yeah, I knew what you were talking about. The only socketed arrowheads I've seen have been from a period of what you would call Scythian influence in the pre-Han era, and they may have actually been foreign arrowheads. The generic Chinese arrowhead is tanged. There are 2 types of tanged arrowheads. There are tanged arrowheads for bamboo shaft, which tend to have long cylindrical tangs. And there are tanged arrowheads for wooden shafts, where the tang is usually no longer than the arrowhead, though it can be sometimes up to twice as long, but the bamboo ones are much longer. The arrowheads for bamboo shafts are much longer.
Yes.
The method of mounting an arrowhead is it's specifically described in the Zhengdu book, where they would get imagine you've got a wooden handle with like an awl, but it's just a piece of hard wire. They would heat that in a brazier until it was red hot, and then they would use that to form the hole. It would burn a hole into the end of the arrow.
And no glue.
No. This is only the first step. The next step is they would shave the end of the arrow down until it was paper thin right at the tip, but formed a cone. Then they would put glue on the tang of the arrowhead and glue it in, or they would put glue and wrap it in fine paper to bulk it out. Glue that on. So what you had was at the base of the arrowhead, it's like that. The tang goes in. The wood comes up until it meets the top of the tang, the base, where the tang comes out of the arrowhead. And then they wrapped it with sinew.
Yes.
To build it up to the same thickness as the base of the arrowhead, which meant that the tip of the arrow is a lot stronger and it's still perfectly tapered for puncturing. If you see modern people making sinew wrapped arrowheads, the sinew is thicker than the shaft because they don't know how they. And you see Indo-Persian and Persian arrowheads that have sinew wrappings. The sinew is smoothly integrated into the shape of the barrel arrow. And this is what the Chinese did. And it was, when I first read that, it kind of like it was magic, because I had all these old arrows and I'm looking at them and I suddenly realized what was going on. Because when an arrow, Western, there's a couple of tests that were done in a historical magazine decades ago, where they were testing Roman arrowheads and they wrapped sinew on them. And the sinew was like an extra millimeter or two thicker than the end of the shaft. And then they said, oh, when you shoot these into armor, they stop at the arrow shaft. But real arrows made by real people, and this includes the very few Roman arrows that have been discovered, they are beautifully tapered. And they hit something, they just keep going. They don't get blocked by their own binding.
Before we go to shapes, what kind of materials did they use? Like copper alloy, iron, steel?
Okay, starting back in the ancient days, up until the Qin dynasty, the first emperor's dynasty, they used mainly bronze. So the arrowheads were cast. Their edges were hardened by work hardening, because bronze work hardens. So you would have a hard piece of something. It could be stone, it could be a different quality of bronze. And after the arrowhead was cast, you would rub it backwards and forwards on its edges, which would compress the metal and harden it. They made lots of different kinds of arrowheads. I've got a collection of failed arrowheads. These were cast in the Han Dynasty and earlier, and the bronze didn't run through the casting completely. So instead of having these, like a skeleton broadhead where the blade is supported by several ribs, I think I might have a picture of one here.
It's like a screw and so, yeah.
These are quite beautiful. I'm seeing if I can find one, because I've got lots of pictures of our heads. I'm going from both sides because these chapters in this book are organized by types of weapons. So these are very early arrowheads. And you can see they've got the barbs are fairly separate. But as you progress, they get more and more elaborate, because the bronze casting techniques were very advanced. And then sometime around the 400s before the current era. Oh, here's one. I can show you the diagram. It might be clearer. You see the arrowhead at the top?
Yes.
See how the blade is supported by little ribs that come out from the center of the shaft?
Yes, I do.
That I've got some of those where the casting didn't work and the blade didn't go the full length. So they cut the stubs off and polished it and turned it into an arrowhead that's perfect for holding rags and that for fire arrows. Oh, here's an interesting thing. Remember I was saying in our last talk about this, that at Mawang Dui, they found the husband of the lady whose body was perfectly preserved. Yes. There is one of the bows.
That's right.
So it's a reflexed bamboo laminated bow.
Yes.
There are a few arrowheads there too, showing the really long tangs. A lot of the arrowheads that have really long tangs are for crossbows, because they were meant to be very heavy and have a large amount of penetration. The arrowheads that are medium length tangs are generally for hand bows. It's just a matter of weight. When the Chinese built crossbows, they built them on the same principle as their hand bows, just very much heavier. And the thing is that in the West, when they started to develop crossbows, they started out with bows that were like a short bow, maybe 1.5 meters long, and gradually made them smaller and smaller, because to make the weapon more maneuverable. But in China, they were always more interested in getting a long draw on their crossbows. So the result was these exceptionally long tangs and really solid arrowheads. I think there might be a picture of a crossbow arrow in here. The thing about it is that Chinese crossbow arrows look very similar to just a short normal arrow. And when I say short, maybe that much shorter than a regular arrow, because they had a very, I would say, the crossbows had such a long draw. There you go. This is an arrow inscribed 6-year Sui Yang of the Han Dynasty, which I think is in the Western Han. And that's the arrow in here.
Yeah.
It's still got its feathers on it. It's over 2,000 years old. And if I remember correctly, it's also got an inscription saying, who it was for. So, yeah, this is
different shapes, correct?
Sorry?
They have different shapes, arrowhead, like Botkin.
Oh, huge number of shapes. Actually, we should do this in a separate one.
Yes.
And I will show you a whole group of arrowheads from the 1100s.
Yes, we will do it separately.
Yeah, because it's just too much. We could go on for ages. This is actually interesting. The same time that crossbow arrow, which you can see in the top, you can actually see its inscription. Perfect. On the bottom, have a look at the bow there.
Yes.
It's almost the same in shape.
Very good.
Bear in mind, it's about the same age too, and it's been in the ground for 1,000 years or more. But, well, let's get back to, we were talking about manufacturing, and I think this is really important to understand. Round about 400 BCE, the Chinese had been casting iron for a couple of centuries, and they were using it to make plowshares and stuff like that. But cast iron has a high carbon content. You can cast it any shape you like, but it's brittle. So somebody, specifically with arrowheads, came up with a new idea. You would cast an arrowhead, you would put it in a furnace that sucked the carbon out of it, reducing it to almost pure iron. It was now not brittle, but it was not hard either. Then they would recarburize it, what we'd call case hardening, and added a layer of carbon to the surface. So you would end up with an arrow that could be mass produced in tens of thousands or millions, because people didn't make arrows in a few thousand. They made them, the arrowheads were made in tens or hundreds of thousands. And this could be done industrially. You could make steel arrowheads from cast iron in a 3-step process. And this is specifically noticed in triangular pyramidal crossbow arrowheads. I think I might have one somewhere, actually. I've got altogether too much stuff laying around. Actually, here's an interesting one. These arrowheads on the top there vaguely look like screwdrivers.
Yes, they do.
They're wedge-shaped arrowheads for splitting armor, which are mentioned in the Middle East in 1360s by Taibucha in his book translated as Saracen Archery, as particularly good for splitting the lamellae of brigandines.
Yes.
Armor with metal plates riveted inside cloth. So that's the level of here's another classic arrowhead shape. You see these a lot in China.
Yes,
I have to poke around to see what's on the
It's screen. Like a spatulated one.
Yes, exactly. It's like a wedge that's widest at the front and tapering towards the rear. Now, I've got quite a few of these arrowheads. They're really common. They keep turning up in excavations. I'm trying to get enough time to make some that I can mount on modern shafts to test what their performance is. Are they as accurate as broadheads? Are they more accurate? What kind of impact do they have? The earliest stone arrowheads from ancient Egypt made out of flint were called in French petit tranchés.
Yeah.
And they were that shape, but they were made out of stone. So people obviously thought this was a really good design for arrowheads. I just don't know why. There's a very famous painting of Saint George and Sergius from the monastery of St. Catherine at Sinai, which is from the 8th or 9th century, maybe the 10th century. And someone's got a close quiver, and one of the saints, Demetrius and Sergius. And you can see in the mouth of the quiver all the different arrowhead shapes. And there's quite a few of these reverse wedge-shaped arrowheads. So they were used all the way across. I haven't seen any reference to them being excavated in Iran, but that may be because I haven't had the chance to see enough Iranian excavation reports, because my guess is that they were probably very popular there too. Certainly the Mongols would have bought them, but I have a feeling they would have arrived with the first Turkish invaders. I don't know why they were so popular, but they definitely were. When we do one with the arrowheads and that, I'll get Peter Decker's article on Qing Dynasty arrows. He wrote a small article. You can download it from his Manchu Archery website. It's basically a translation of a series of specifications for arrows for military and ceremonial use during the Qing Dynasty. And it's really useful because the designs of the arrowheads go back way back. Like the Qing Dynasty started in 1644. There are arrowhead styles they were using that you can see in excavations from 200 or 300 BCE.
My suggestion is, Bede, in the next meeting we are going to have next week, we are going to concentrate on Chinese arrowheads, different shapes of them. Okay?
I think that would be really good because, I mean, we underestimate how sophisticated these things were because they're not in general discussion. The Chinese wrote from the 11th century, wrote military encyclopedias. These were large collections of the author would go and find every military work that he could find that was relevant to his time, and assemble it all into a big encyclopedia with, ways of looking things up and finding stuff. And they were illustrated. They were mass produced and they were illustrated. So they were printed with pictures, and things like Novak, there's illustrations of them from these encyclopedias and descriptions. It's really, I mean, if you study Chinese archaeology and things like that, you're aware of this because the archaeologists can go, oh, wait a minute, this thing we've just dug up, we found it in a book. Oh, now we finally know what that's supposed to mean. But here's, like, these are illustrations from encyclopedias. On the bottom row, bouquets and quiver. And if you look at paintings from the era, this is Ming, I think. If you look at paintings from that era, they depict bouquets and quivers just like this.
Okay.
So, the last thing that I would like to talk about is in this book, the author, this is Professor Yang Hong, has a catalogue of what a regiment, what the equipment of a regiment of warriors was. And it's really interesting reading from, I mean, in our other area of interest in armor, it lists by reign period from 1134 AD down to 1168. Armor, like armor for an archer. This is a lamellar armor. Number of scales between 1812 and 1818. Weight, 31 caddies. So caddy is a translation of the Chinese word jin, which is 1.3 pounds, to 36 caddies. The shoulder piece, number of plates, 646 to 850. The weight, he gives the weight, 7 caddies. The helmet, number of, and this is the neck guard, the lamellar neck guard, 349 to 420, weight, 6 caddies, which is not that bad for a helmet. That's actually quite light for a helmet. Total weight of the armor, 47 caddies, which add a third to that, you're looking maybe at 70, 80 pounds. So this is really amazing stuff when you think about it. Finally found it. This is complete equipment for an army of 12,500 men. Type of weapon. So in shooting weapons, 12,500 men would have 2,500 crossbows, 12,500 longbows, each, and we mean composite bows. Sorry, I misread that. There would be 3 strings per bow and 30 arrows for each. There would be a bow case. Well, they call it bow case, longbow case set. 12,500. There are a number of printing errors in this section of the table, but you can work it out. So your average soldier carried 30 arrows, 3 strings, so that would be 2 spare strings plus the string on the bow. I think the 30 times 12,500 gives you a number of arrows for this group. The crossbows also had 3 bowstrings and 100 arrows for each crossbow. Other things like only 10,000 people had swords. Everybody had a spear. So, I mean, in general, everybody had a spear. Most people had a sword. Everybody had a bow and arrow. A smaller proportion had a crossbow. There's no indication that if you had a crossbow, you didn't have a bow. But if you look at the illustrations, they never show crossbowmen carrying a bow case and quiver. So my guess is maybe they had a bow assigned to them, and when they were on horseback or something, they did it. There's a so I mean, like, this is straight out of one of these encyclopedias.
Perfect.
So,
okay,
wonderful detail.
Okay, Bede, thank you very much for the discussion today. We are going to continue the third session on the arrowheads, right, of Chinese arrowheads. Thank you for taking.
I'll have some arrows to show you and a lot of arrowheads. I'll get out the really old ones.
Perfect.
So I think it'll be interesting.
Thank you very much. Thank you and see you soon.